describe the structure of the human skin. So before describing the structure of the human skin, let's see what it looks like. So we have the hair here, as you all can see. Then we can zoom and see the epidermis region. Then the aractopuli muscles, the dermis, the sebaceous glands. You can zoom that and see the sebaceous glands, the sweat glands, the nerve fibers, the blood vessels. Now as a whole, you can see the hair, the epidermis, the aractopuli muscles, the dermis, sebaceous gland, sweat gland, nerve fiber, blood vessels. So it consists of two main layers. So what are the two main layers? Epidermis and the dermis. The layer underneath the skin is called the subcutaneous layer. So remember that the layer that is found underneath the skin is called the subcutaneous layer. Now what is this subcutaneous layer composed of? It is composed of number 1, adipose tissue, and number 2, we have areolar tissue. So the layer underneath the skin is called the subcutaneous layer, and now which is composed of adipose tissue and areolar tissue. Epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. Epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. Now what does it consist of? Which consists of stratified, keratinized, squamous epithelium. So there are 3 adjectives that specify this epithelium. You have to say stratified, keratinized, squamous epithelium. So stratified, it's keratinized, and it's the squamous type of epithelium. So we have to be very specific. I'm not discussing these things. I'm just, as you all have already learned these lessons, I'm just trying to point out the important words that are required definitely for the essay. Epidermis is not supplied with blood vessels. That's a very critical point. Epidermis is not supplied with blood vessels. There are several layers of cells in the epidermis. Several layers of cells in the epidermis. The deepest layer is the germinative layer. The deepest layer of the epidermis is the germinative layer. Now what is the speciality in this? What's the speciality in this region? From which epidermal cells are originated constantly. So the deepest layer is the germinative layer, from which epidermal cells are originated, generated constantly. The cells on the surface are flat, thin, non-nucleated, and dead. So there are several points that you have to remember here. The cells on the surface, that we are talking about the epidermis now, the cells on the surface. What can you say about the cells on the surface? Well, they are flat. What else? They're thin. They're non-nucleated. They don't have a nucleus. So they're thin, they are flat, they're non-nucleated, and they are dead too. So the cells on the surface are flat, they are thin. Not only that, they are non-nucleated and they are dead. So there are 4 features that you remember when you're considering the cells on the surface. They are flat, they are thin, they're non-nucleated, and they are dead. So melanocytes in the deep germinative layer. So if they ask in a structured essay question, where are melanocytes located? The exact location? They're located in the deep germinative layer of the epidermis, right? Melanocytes are located in the deep germinative layer of the epidermis of the skin. So melanocytes are located in the deep germinative layer. Now what is the function of this? Well, which secretes a dark pigment. The melanocytes do secrete a dark pigment. So what's it named? Melanin. What does it contribute to? It contributes to skin color. See how easy this is. Melanocytes in the deep germinative layer, which secretes a dark pigment called melanin. It contributes to skin color. We all know that. Dermis, on the other hand, is composed of areolar connective tissues. So the dermis is composed of areolar connective tissues. So I advise you to go back to the tissue lessons and just see actually what do these words mean. Areola, adipose, just browse through them again and then read this essay again. Just listen to that again. Then you get a better understanding. The structures present in the dermis, what do you find in the dermis? We find blood and lymph vessels. We find blood and lymph vessels. So as vessels, we find blood and lymph vessels. Remember that together. Then we do have sensory nerve endings, don't we? Yeah, we have sensory nerve endings. We have to have them, right? To feel sensations. Sweat glands too. We sweat, all of us. Then we have sebaceous glands. What else? We have hair. We have erector pili muscles. We have sensory receptors. Now all this is contained where? In the dermis, right? Remember that. The structures present in the dermis. So we have lymph vessels, we have sensory nerve endings. What else? We have sweat glands, sebaceous glands, we have hair, we have erector pili muscles, we have sensory receptors. Actually, you may be confused. Sometimes you all may be knowing this, but what's the real function of the sebaceous glands? They secrete sebum, the actual complex oils, right? That can include triglycerides, fatty acids, like fatty acid breakdown products like waxes, esters, choline, cholesterol, things like that. What does it really do? You don't have to write this at all in the essay, but I'm just talking just to remember this. So sebum actually, what does it do? It lubricates the skin, right? Generally to protect against friction, and also it's acting as a barrier. Because it's impervious to the moisture. This waterproof action is there. So that's the basic thing. There's no point learning these things if you don't really know the functions of these things. Just memorizing won't do. Particularly in MCQs, you have to know the real functions of these glands. They can ask, they have the right to ask, though they have not mentioned that. So yeah, so what are the sensory receptors? Meissner's corpuscle, Pacinian corpuscles, free nerve endings. You all can find out the functions of these Meissner's corpuscles, the Pacinian corpuscles, free nerve endings, the bulb of Krause, organ of Ruffini, the Merkel disc from your resource book. You don't have to write the functions here, but it's better to refer back into those things, and then with that understanding write this essay. Then if you know the functions of the Meissner's corpuscles and those things, you all can remember what these things are better. So you all also came across the areolar tissue. What else? We came across the stratified cormus tissue and things like that, which were in previous lessons also. So go back to those lessons, get an understanding about those things, and then read this thing again. Then you all can understand it better and remember it better. With a proper understanding, overall understanding. So you all don't have to exert yourselves trying to memorize these things, but you all can really understand and write an essay. Then read the essay a few times, like 3-4 times, then you'll get hold of it with that understanding. Once with an understanding, if you can remember an essay, you all can remember it for a long time. But if you memorize, you all have to memorize it 50 times. It depends on the person, but I advise you to understand and write essays because it's important for the structured essays, and particularly in MCQs. You need understanding in MCQs to score high marks. So when you write an essay, how many MCQ questions are involved in an essay? So those points are very important. Explain the role of the skin in regulating temperature. The skin contributes to the regulation of body temperature as it provides the passage through which heat can be lost or gained depending on the body requirements. It is the passage, right? It provides the passage for heat loss and heat gain. It provides that passage. So the skin contributes to regulation of body temperature as it provides the passage through which heat can be lost or heat can be gained depending on the body temperature or body requirements. Depending on the body requirements, it provides the passage through which heat can be lost or gained. So we'll see how the skin contributes to regulation of body temperature. When the body temperature is increased above the normal range, now we have to concentrate. Increased above the normal range. There's a normal range here. If the temperature is increased above that range, we'll see what happens. Now, above the normal range. So this is the normal range. So if you increase the temperature above the normal range, we'll see how the skin helps us get it back to the normal range. The sweat glands secrete sweat on the skin surface. So the sweat glands, what do? They secrete sweat on the skin surface. Very easy. So evaporation of sweat cools the body surface, doesn't it? So evaporation of sweat cools the body surface. So when sweat evaporates from our body surface, right, it cools the body surface. It traps the heat and evaporates, right? You know that you need heat to vaporize, right? Even water, right? You have to supply heat for it to vaporize. Natural evaporation is there, but we have to supply heat, particularly when you're boiling water. So evaporation of sweat cools the body temperature. The evaporation of sweat cools the body surface. It takes the heat and leaves the body surface. When heat stressed, heat lost can be promoted by increasing the blood flow through the skin capillaries. So when heat stressed, that means when there's a higher heat in the body. When heat stressed, heat loss can be promoted. How? By increasing the blood flow through the skin capillaries. This can be done by increasing the blood flow through the skin capillaries. How can we increase the blood flow through the skin capillaries? By dilating arterioles. By dilating arterioles, what you can do is that you can increase the blood flow through the skin capillaries. Now when the body temperature falls beyond a normal range, now we are coming back. When the body temperature falls beyond the normal temperature. When the body temperature falls beyond the normal range, then what happens? Heat loss, that word heat should be there. Heat loss through the skin capillaries can be minimized. So the heat loss through the skin capillaries can be minimized. So how do you minimize? See how logical this is. How easy you can remember. You don't have to memorize this at all. How practical it is. There's a lot of physics involved also. So heat loss through the skin capillaries can be minimized. How can you minimize? By constricting the arterioles. You can constrict the arterioles. The arterioles are trying to hide, kind of. By constricting the arterioles, where in the dermis. You can constrict the arterioles in the dermis. Now, loss through the skin capillaries can be minimized by constricting the arterioles in the dermis. Now, when cold stressed, what happens? Contraction of erector pili muscles attached to the hair can generate body heat and contribute to the heat production. So when cold stressed, contraction of the erector pili muscles attached to the hair can generate body heat and also contribute to the heat production. Now don't confuse this with homeostatic regulation of body temperature, because in that, if they ask an essay from that particular topic, we have to explain more. Homeostatic regulation of body temperature in humans, these points are also there, but you have to explain a lot more. You have to mention about the thermostat, the hypothalamus, and things like that. So always remember to concentrate on the question. What are they really asking? So don't mess up, because what most of us do is that when you go to the exams, we we know the answers, but we are not answering the question. So role of the human skin, because when they are talking about the human skin, the resource book, they have mentioned this as a question actually. So when you're coming to homeostatic regulation of body temperature in humans, you have to mention a lot more points, including these points also. I'll show you through the structure of the ovary. So the question is, describe the structure of the human ovary. So let's see. I'll zoom it in to identify all the locations precisely. You can see the germinal epithelium here. Germinal epithelium. Germinal epithelium. Then you can see the primordial follicle. Observe very carefully the germinal epithelium. We have the primordial follicle. We have the medulla region. We have the ovarian follicle approaching maturity. So this ovarian follicle is in the verge of approaching maturity. The medulla and the ovarian follicle approaching maturity. Observe the structures carefully. The primordial follicle again. The ovarian follicle approaching maturity. Now we come and meet a large structure, mature ovarian follicle, and inside that we have liqua folliculi. We have the ovum. We have the ruptured follicle. We have the ovum that is released now. Early it was in the mature ovarian follicle. Now it is released from the mature ovarian follicle, the ruptured follicle. Then we come across the corpus luteum. Then we come across the fully formed corpus luteum. Then we meet fibrous corpus albicans. Once again, let's go around. We can see the blood vessels. High blood supply is there, isn't it? The germinal epithelium, we can see. The primordial follicle again. The medulla. Ovarian follicle approaching maturity. Mature ovarian follicle. Liqua folliculi. Ovum. Ruptured follicle and the ovum. Now see this structure as a whole, as a full image. Just observe that for some time. You can pause the video and observe that again. Try to keep this in your head, the proper structure. You have to draw that when they ask a question like that. So once you have this image in your memory, it's very easy to write the essay. So let's discuss the essay and see that image again. The female gonads are the two ovaries. The female gonads are the two ovaries. They are found on either sides of the uterus. They are found on either sides of the uterus. They are held in place in the abdominal cavity by ligaments. So ligaments help to hold these gonads, the female gonads, the two ovaries, in place in the abdominal cavity. Remember, it's in the abdominal cavity and is held by ligaments. In the ovary, female gametes are stored. So the female gametes are stored in the ovary and develop prior to ovulation, and they do develop prior to ovulation. So in the ovary we have female gametes, They are stored there, and they are developed prior to ovulation. So they do develop prior to ovulation. The ovaries have two tissue layers. Ovaries have two tissue layers. So what are the two tissue layers in the ovary? Outer, the cortex; inner, the medulla. So we have outer, the cortex, and inner, the medulla. We saw that in our images. The outer layer of the ovary, the outer layer of each ovary consists of connective tissues, and they are covered by germinal epithelium. See, you have to go back to the image. With the image, go with this. Then you can understand it better. The outer layer of each ovary consists of connective tissues covered by the germinal epithelium. The outer layer consists of what? Of ovarian follicles. And we saw that they are in various stages of maturity. They're growing. So the outer layer consists of ovarian follicles in various stages of maturity. Each follicle consists of an oocyte. So each follicle, remember, consists of an oocyte. Each follicle consists of an oocyte. Follicles are the structures that cover the oocyte. So what is the oocyte? It's actually an immature egg, not yet matured. So each follicle consists of an oocyte, which is a partially developed egg surrounded by support cells. So they may ask the definition in your structured essays. So what is an oocyte? Which is a partially developed. The word partial is very important there. Partially developed egg surrounded. Partially developed egg surrounded by support tissues. The support tissues protect and they nourish. They don't only protect, they have two functions. They protect the oocyte, they also nourish the oocyte, provide with nutrients, nourish the oocyte during its development. So the support cells, what do? Number one, they protect. Number two, they nourish the oocyte during its development. The outer cortex consists with primordial follicle. The outer cortex consists of the primordial follicle. Ovarian follicle approaching maturity. You can see the structures that are present in the outer cortex. The primordial follicle, ovarian follicle approaching maturity. Now remember, these are in different periods. Primordial follicle, ovarian follicle approaching maturity. Then we have the mature ovarian follicle. We have the ruptured follicle. Now the ruptured follicle, it turns into corpus luteum. We saw that. Finally, we have corpus albicans. Now these are, as I said, in different time periods, not at the same time. Corpus albicans is composed of fibrous tissue. So the corpus albicans is composed of fibrous tissue. Once again, now as we have read something about the ovary, let's see the structure again. We came across germinal epithelium, primordial follicle, medulla, ovarian follicle approaching maturity, mature ovarian follicle, liquor folliculi inside, the ovum, the ruptured follicle, ovum, corpus luteum, the structure, fully formed corpus luteum, fibrous corpus albicans, particular structure. So the blood vessels are also there. So remember this. If you know the structure, you can easily remember the essay. Explain the process of parturition and hormone regulation. Explain the process of what? Of parturition, process of parturition and hormonal regulation. We'll see. Related to parturition. So labor, what do you mean by labor? Labor is a series of strong. They may ask what is labor in your structured and essays. So what is labor? A series of strong, rhythmic, uterine contractions. Separate the words contractions, uterine, rhythmic, and strong. So what do you have? The labor is a series of strong, rhythmic uterine contractions. A series of strong, rhythmic uterine contractions. They are uterine contractions, but they are not just uterine contractions, they are rhythmic and they are strong. So what's the function of this? What do you need this for? To push the fetus and placenta out of the body. Now most of us just remember the fetus, but we forget the placenta. Should not forget that. It's really having a great role. So the labor is a series of strong rhythmic uterine contractions which pushes the fetus and the placenta out of the body. Now when labor begins, local regulators and hormones. So what are the local regulators? Prostaglandins and hormones. What are the hormones? Mainly estradiol and oxytocin. Right? Or estradiol and oxytocin. Remember those two, estradiol and oxytocin. So when labor begins, local regulators and prostaglandins, hormones, prostaglandins, those are the regulators, local regulators, and then hormones also induce mainly. So what are the hormones? Mainly estradiol and oxytocin. So once again, when labor begins, local regulators and hormones induce and regulate. What do? They induce and they regulate. Don't get confused, right? That's one sentence. When labor begins, local regulators and hormones induce and they regulate further contractions of the uterus. This is a positive feedback mechanism. Uterine contractions stimulate secretion of oxytocin. Right? When uterine contractions happen, it stimulates further secretion of oxytocin. And it stimulates further contraction of the uterus. So uterine contractions stimulate the secretion of oxytocin, and then it stimulates the further contraction of the uterus. That's why we call it positive feedback. The labor can be divided into 3 stages. So what are the 3 stages of labor? First stage is the thinning, number 1, and then the opening up, we can say the dilation of the cervix. The second stage is what? We saw the first stage is thinning and the opening up of the cervix. The second stage is the delivery of the baby. Strong contractions, continuous. So actually there's a small error in this marking scheme. Just cut this off. So in this stage, in the second stage, now what is the second stage? Is the delivery of the baby. In this stage, continuous and strong contractions. Remember that it's continuous, it's happening fast, continuously. In this stage, continuous and strong contractions force the fetus out of the uterus. It tries to send it away, forces the fetus out of the uterus and then finally expels through the vagina. Now the final stage of labor is the delivery of the placenta. But don't forget that. Finally, it's the delivery of the placenta. So we'll end our essay program from here.